Welcome to episode 2 of Cyclops is Waiting For Me, an X-Men the Animated Series weekly recap podcast. I'm Rod Kim. You can check me out. I have my own website, rodkim.com.
And I'm JC. You can find me on the Whiskey and Waffles Discord channel, which we are going to have our own channel within that Discord dedicated to this podcast. The links are in our link tree and you can find them through all our social stuff. Discord is a hell of a thing to link to because it's not exactly something I could customize. So,
so it's like a weird like JZ259.
Yeah, exactly. But we will make sure that it is abundantly clear on our social media how to get into the podcast channel to talk about our favorite X-Men animated show. I think that's fair. This is our favorite X-Men animated show.
Oh, yeah.
So Cyclops is Waiting For Me is our weekly podcast series where we're going to go back and watch every single episode of the original 1992 X-Men the Animated Series in their original intended script order, building up to the release of X-Men 97 that's coming to Disney Plus next year.
And some quick reminders, we are a recap show about a series that came out 30 years ago, so there's going to be spoilers. If you don't want it spoiled for you, pause the podcast, watch the episode, and come back. They're easy watches, like 20 minutes long. We'll do our best to avoid mentioning anything about future episodes we haven't covered yet. We're currently not sponsored or affiliated with Disney or Disney Plus in any way, but, you know, this could be us.
As I was alluding to earlier, don't forget to follow us on social media at Cyclops IWFM Pod on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. And of course, make sure to follow us on whatever your favorite podcast service is. Finally, we record these episodes in batches right now. So if we are reacting to news and it seems like we're a little out of date, it's because we probably recorded this 3 or 4 weeks prior. Unfortunately, we are not Destiny. We cannot see into the future. If we could, I would be a lot richer. But yeah, that's kind of where we are.
Can't look into the future yet. Now on to the show. Today we're going to be talking about episode 3, Enter Magneto. What an ominous title, but that was awesome. If I'm not mistaken, this episode was part of the VHS tape, I think, at Pizza Hut.
So I'm going to defer to you. Coming from where I do, we don't eat Pizza Hut.
Okay.
In the Northeast, that is a cardinal sin to eat Pizza Hut.
Well, now it definitely would be. In the 90s, Pizza Hut was like the place to take the family, at least in my area.
Again, in the Northeast, it is not.
Central Indiana. So we had a whole like kids meal that had like the little personal pizza with the like the X-Men on the cover and everything. But I might be wrong. Someone correct me if I am. For some reason, I remember there being like the first 2 episodes and then Enter Magneto like on the same thing, because even before the show came out, I just remember like how like badass Magneto was, and you know how much like most of the kids who were fans of the X-Men were like, yeah, he's the bad guy.
For me, I wasn't really reading X-Men comics when I got into comics, even at 8 or 9 years old, as we were in the build-up time for when this series came out. I was mostly reading Spider-Man at the time. Okay. So occasionally you'd see Magneto referenced and stuff like that. I remember specifically having the original Secret Wars action figure, and one of the ones I had was Magneto. And I don't know why, because I never said his name or anything. I think it was just a matter of that was one of the ones that my mom found at the store, because I was young enough when Secret Wars came out that it was like, cool, he just likes superheroes.
He has a helmet.
But I do distinctly remember the original Marvel trading cards and seeing the different villains, a lot of them for the first time through that set, and Magneto being one of those that stood out to me. And it was through the series that I actually found out just how integral a character Magneto was. So,
also, I think this was the first episode we heard the previously on X-Men.
I believe you are right. Jumping into the episode, it starts out with Beast, who is in a cell, and he's reading Animal Farm, which I thought was really interesting because the story of Animal Farm has nothing to do with the fact that it's actually animals. It's just how chaotic the world is, and you know, what happens when entities are trying to overreach and get involved in people's lives and stuff like that. But also, Beast is the one who is the animal of the group, just from a physical appearance.
And the guards think he's reading a picture book.
Yeah, the guards can't fathom that he is smart enough to be able to indulge in anything that could be intellectual. Meanwhile, those guards are definitely way too dumb to understand the nuance of Animal House. Understand the nuance.
I mean, there's nuance in Animal House, right?
Understand the nuance of Animal Farm.
We should call this episode The Nuance of Animal House.
Yeah.
Well, we talk a lot about things that don't age well. This is something I think that not only aged well in the political sense, but as like a person individually. Because I remember as a kid watching that, I don't know what Animal Farm was, because at 10 years old, I didn't even know that was something I was supposed to read. And then I think later on, I had read it in like high school, I think, is when they make you read that.
Yeah, usually it's not till high school.
And then probably like college, we were starting to rewatch X-Men the animated series and stuff, I was like, oh, that was that book that Beast was reading.
Yep.
At the time, I just thought it was guards being mean, and they were. But now I know it was the guards being mean and dumb.
Yeah, they were mean, they were effectively racist, and they were dumb.
Yeah.
We see that there's an attack on the location, and that's the first time that we see Magneto formally. We got the allusion to him in episode 1, where you saw him on the screen, but they didn't mention who it was or anything like that. And you just see how damn powerful he is. Like, he by himself does more damage to this location than the X-Men as a team were able to do in defending themselves against the Sentinels and everything like that. He just goes in and wrecks shop.
It makes a good argument for, like, he might be right. Whether you agree with that or not, is the fact, like you said, like, he comes in, he gets the objective done. And it's just like in and out. You know, I remember his entrance, 2 things. How you feel his presence before as a kid, like, that was awesome. Even as an adult, it's like, so you see like the guns go away, and even like the little gag with the pants falling down on the guard.
Or the tank that just gets disassembled.
Yeah. And then when he finally appears, I think, if I remember right, he's in his like magnetism ball or whatever that is.
The what looks like an electric bubble, but yes, it's supposed to be the ball of magnetism. Yeah.
That was the coolest thing. I think that, like, as a child, like, signified like, oh, he's powerful, you know?
The one thing in that scene that I did forget is that there was a drop in animation quality when the yellow circles were expanding. It went to like a reduced frame rate.
I didn't notice that.
Yeah, I don't know if maybe it's just the version I'm watching on Disney Plus, but it is a reduction in quality of the animation. Like, all of a sudden it's coming in at half of the speed than it normally would. It was just, I don't know if maybe rose-colored glasses, but I don't remember that from when I did my original watch of it.
I mean, if we didn't mention this in the first episode, this wasn't like a top quality, like, animated show, but it's part of what we loved about it.
It was a good quality, but it wasn't the most well-funded. I think one of the things that Eric Lewald talks about in his book, which, again, we will mention that throughout the entire series, is they were looking at competing with Batman, the animated series, and the budget for Batman was 3 times what they were getting for X-Men, the animated series.
And this is just something from Ron Wasserman, so I don't have anything else to verify this, but I think he mentioned that, to his knowledge, Saban's deal with Fox was that Saban would cover all the post-production costs for X-Men if he could get a slot for Power Rangers. So it would make sense it was a reduced budget.
So what Eric talks about in the book was apparently Saban had the deal that he was paid a fixed rate. Wow. So he made more money if he got better deals on it. And the original cut, which they had to redo, he was saying, well, I'm not going to spend any more money on it. I've spent my money. And then Marvel actually gave up their licensing fee that they were given for the first season and basically re-put it into animation. And if they hadn't done it, we would have seen a much lower quality show. So this was even the better version of the animation than what the original was. Yeah. So we start to get some insight into Magneto and the phrase, make us superior. And that really, really stood out to me because it shows the start of the divergence of Magneto and Charles Xavier's perspective. Magnus is very focused on, we are the next evolution and we can dominate these ants, essentially. Whereas Charles is always so focused on, we should work with them. We should not give them a reason to fear us. Magneto is all about them fearing it. He commands fear, and that is what is going to help him win his personal war. One thing that stood out to me years later, of course, you know, not having the knowledge I do of X-Men history after reading comics for the past 30 years or so, Magneto's origin changed. And it was, they met after a war, and they keep it very vague. They're also able to ignore the time change at that point, because if you look at Magneto's real origin in the comics, he was a Holocaust survivor. So by the 90s, it would have been 50 full years later. We don't have the magic of comic book time.
Yeah.
So he lost his family in this vague war. And that's where he and Charles decide they are going to help some captives. And Charles is able to stop Magneto from going over the edge and killing the soldiers that had captured these people. And that was the first and only time in the canon of the show they had had a conflict. But Xavier knew that Magneto was continuing down his darker pursuit. The thing I thought was really, really funny is they said he has a growing legion, but they only show him in solo shots.
Oh, yeah. It's funny because even though they didn't mention that Magneto's a Holocaust survivor in the show, for whatever reason, maybe it was the comic books, I had connected that as a kid as like that vague war was.
See, I didn't in the show. One, because I didn't have the knowledge of the comic books, but the area where they showed it, I definitely got kind of like a Vietnam War vibe based on the clothing that the characters were wearing.
This was interesting too, because, and I don't know, I'm guessing this was purposeful, but maybe not. If it wasn't, it was just serendipitous. They're kind of showing that in a way, Xavier had like a privileged upbringing, even though he definitely had his setbacks, but Magneto having survived like all the, no matter what way you cut it, like the Holocaust, like the Vietnam
losing
War,
his
whatever.
family. Yeah.
All that stuff. He was like, listen, man, like you don't cut these guys off now. They're not going to stop taking stuff away from you.
Yep.
And Xavier, regardless of whose side you're on this, is just kind of like, no, peace will always work, because he hasn't really known, up to this point, like that kind of loss.
Right.
And stuff. So it's really interesting that both sides, in a way, you can't say the one or the other is like more right necessarily, but like are justified to some degree, you know, their actions.
Oh, by the way, so Magneto originally went there to break out Beast, and Beast decides he wants his day in court. And Magneto basically alludes to the fact that, oh, you've already drank the Kool-Aid. You've accepted the feudal plan of Charles. So if that's what you want to do, that's what you want to do. And then we jump over to Beast in court. The lawyer, his name is Hodge. And I think that's really interesting because a character who will be used later in the series is named Cameron Hodge. And apparently these two have no connection to each other from the research I was able to do. I don't know if that was
the name.
It was just said Hodge. And I was like, oh, is that Cameron? Again, from growth of X-Men knowledge. And I did some digging, and it is not the same person according to it.
And I thought it was interesting that the judge had kind of this like performative, ethical, it's almost like theatrical equality. You just kind of saw it in his, it's funny to say body language, but they actually animated this. He was incredibly
dismissive as to when Beast wants to speak on his own behalf and starts quoting Shakespeare. And he basically says like, can you get on with it?
Yeah. But even before then, he's like, we don't want anybody to think that we're not being fair, blah, blah. So that like, if you just read the words on paper, like seems right. But if you're there in the room, you're like, oh yeah, that's not what he meant.
Yeah. And then as Beast is proving his point, or trying to prove his point of the no need to fear us and stuff, you get the cartoon moment. It's the most cartoon moment of the entire episode, where people literally throw tomatoes at Beast.
I was wondering about this. Like, they bring these to court?
It's a legit question in society. Like, did people just carry around tomatoes in like the 40s and 50s? that became like a trope in Looney Tunes and stuff like that, and continued into like probably the 90s. I want to say once we got out of the 90s, like that trope kind of died down. But that was just a thing in cartoons, is like if you disagreed with somebody, if it was in a public space, it was probably throwing tomatoes. And then I do know in bars, especially Southern bars, they would literally have to put up wire mesh in front of performers because people would throw beer bottles at them and such.
So I grew up in Indiana. That was very common.
People just threw beer bottles at you.
The chicken wire in front of the band.
Yeah. But that is immediately countered by Sabretooth attacking the courtroom.
So I had a question about that.
Yeah.
Was that another Sentinel moment, hiding in the shadows? Did nobody notice like the 8-foot tall, like Tiger Man?
I don't think, and I have nothing to base this on other than the fact that he was never shown. Like there wasn't like big burly dude in a trench coat or something like that, like sitting behind Scott and Wolverine and stuff like that. I think he burst in, and I think this was one of those times where they would talk about the fact that they would overwrite episodes where they would have to trim content. I'd imagine it was just a matter of there was a shot where he burst through the door and then the door scene got cut for time. I don't think you could have that scene where that big of a dude is hiding there. And Cyclops obviously reacts to it and doesn't know who Sabretooth is, because he says, we have to stop him, they're going to kill him. And Wolverine's direct quote is good.
You can tell there's history there.
Yeah, and all of a sudden, like, oh, there is something way deeper between these two characters here. Mm-hmm. There's a little bit of a conflict. It ends up with Sabretooth getting injured, and they bring him back to the mansion. And I thought what was really great, from an illusion standpoint, is Storm compares Wolverine to Sabretooth. So while we don't know exactly what has been going on in Wolverine's past, we know that he has not always been the most stable character. Because if Storm, who of anybody is the most articulate and regal of any of the characters on the show, is saying, this used to be you. Imagine how bad somebody like Gambit would describe Wolverine back in his early days.
Yeah. I thought it was interesting too that even though this is the third episode, this is like the second like story.
It's the second story, yeah.
That they're essentially kind of showing the dichotomy of bringing, they did the same thing they did with Jubilee in their actions, but it's turning out like a little different because we as the audience, visually see Sabretooth as this threat, but in their context, except for Wolverine, are probably like, hey, we're going to help this guy.
Yep.
He's troubled,
So while they have brought Sabretooth back to the mansion, we see Magneto attacking a military base. Launch control is the phrasing they use.
Yeah.
And even though it wasn't really formally discussed, this definitely had reference to the original X-Men #1 because the original core team, which was Cyclops, Angel, Beast, Marvel Girl, who we know as Jean, and Iceman, were stopping Magneto from attacking a military base. So that was definitely a thing. They modernized it to this group, but it felt appropriate that the first time you see Magneto in the comics, the first time you see Magneto in the show, it was still the attack on a military base.
Yeah, they're like, well, it worked. So.
Yeah. And this was, we've seen now two conflicts. You've seen mutants versus humans, and now you've seen mutant versus mutant. And I think that's a really interesting dynamic because you're seeing the war that the X-Men are going to inevitably be forced to fight is on multiple fronts. I thought that was really cool. What were your thoughts on that scene?
The whole like missile base thing.
Yeah, the whole missile base.
It was interesting because like it should have been jarring because we went from this whole court thing to like this other situation, but it felt so seamless that like when I was rewatching it, by the time Storm was stopping the warheads, I was like, wait, how did we arrive here? And then I like rewound. I'm like, oh no, they just like cut to it. But like it made sense because we're introduced to Magneto and like his whole mission, and then we're seeing like the actions of that mission. If you haven't figured it out yet, Storm's like my favorite character in the X-Men. And so the fact that is not her introduction, but I think it's one of her earliest actions in the series. And you see that she's a Boy Scout in the sense of like she's doing the right thing, but not necessarily the most performative ways like Cyclops. Cyclops is like always like, he wants everybody to know it.
Yeah.
She just went in and she's like, I'm going to stop it. And they're like, what is she doing? I like that she was so quick about her actions that she was in the middle of it before everybody else was like realizing. Because it wasn't like, was it Cyclops that asked, like, what is she doing?
Well, you had Magneto basically took out the group, which was Storm, Cyclops, and was it Wolverine? It was the trio.
Yeah.
And he gets the warheads to launch and he just leaves. And he's like, cool, you get to watch the world burn.
Yeah.
Knowing that it's not going to blow up over the military base. And Storm is just ready to sacrifice herself. Whereas Cyclops sometimes can be seen as playing the leader. Storm was willing to just put herself out there. But I think that was also like one of those scenarios where it was like she showed she wasn't the leader yet because she was going to jump to sacrificing herself instead of an alternate method of solving the problem.
Yeah. She was like jumped in without thinking of like options because we then see that Xavier like kind of like, I don't know, what do you call it, like phones in to her mind.
Yeah.
And she's like, we don't know exactly how the physics of this works, but he's like, here's the schematics.
Yep.
And Storm apparently is a literal rocket scientist.
I mean,
sure.
Electricity.
Yeah. And so she understands schematics, knows how to apply that to her lightning powers and stuff. Something else I liked about that little section was it like physically took something from her. And I think now they think about it as a kid, like that kind of signaled to me that like, oh, these aren't just like unlimited powers. Like they take something from you. Because I think, if I remember right, she just completely passed out. And Wolverine grabs her.
She got caught as she was falling, and Wolverine, which, by the way, if we want to go into the suspension of disbelief, if you're falling from the sky and Wolverine catches you, you're hitting metal bars, essentially.
Yeah, adamantium arms.
He is not thick enough that there's enough padding from his muscles that doesn't just break you. But again, we accept it. Yeah.
Well, Storm gets knocked around, we'll see throughout the series and stuff. So we're like, okay, so she has some level of physical like durability or strength or something. But it was interesting because there was just a split second, if you haven't seen it, if it was your first time watching it, you think she might be dead because even Cyclops says like, is she? Yeah. And then Wolverine's like, oh, she's just something like she's just sleeping or something.
Yeah. And it kind of plays off of the previous episode because Morph does get killed in in the previous episode. So the assumption that, again, death can happen is still there. Luckily, Storm does not die in this episode, so keeps you happy since it's one of your favorite characters. And it ends with Magneto essentially monologuing to himself. And he talks about, so you've turned on your own kind. And it ended with a to be continued. And I thought that was really interesting because technically this is also a two-parter, but it is a two-parter with different names to the episodes.
Yeah. And it's kind of a different story too, as we'll get into the next time. Rewinding just like a little bit, the end, like when Storm passes out, her action created this interesting bonding moment between Cyclops and Wolverine that we had not seen any evidence of before.
Yeah.
Like they were just butting heads the entire time. And then something, I don't know if I'm reading too much into it, but seeing Storm just like not argue with anybody and just be like, I'm just do the right thing, shook these two out of their bullshit. And they're just like, oh, yeah, right. We're on a mission.
So like we talked about, this episode kind of showcases two different things. On one side, they're facing the humans because of the bigotry and such associated to something that they don't understand. But this episode, like I was saying, is where you start to see the mutant versus mutant conflict. Our first story was focused on mutants versus human, but this one really shows that there is differences in the path that can be taken. A lot of the relationship between Magneto and Professor X gets compared to Malcolm X and Martin Luther King because there is such a different approach to get to the end goal. And the end goal, in theory, is always the same. It's just the route that they're taking to get there. Because at the end of the day, mutants just do not want to be persecuted for who they are. And it becomes, well, are you being persecuted for being different? And is there a way to work together? And two sides of the same coin. One side is believing we can work together. You just need to accept us versus we just need to be treated better and we're going to take it by force if we have to. Again, one of those things that seems so intellectual for a Saturday morning kids cartoon. Like you wouldn't have normally expected to see or hear something like that. But then as you start to listen to the writers and understand the origins of the X-Men as characters, it all really starts to make a lot of sense.
Yeah, it's one of my earlier, if not earliest, memories of a show that didn't just like, I think I was just programmed before the cartoons I was watching, everything from like Scooby-Doo to Popeye to Transformers is like, these are the good guys, they're good because they're good. These are the bad guys, they're bad because they're bad. And that was fine. And that was something that was a comfortable, familiar, like setup and stuff. And this one, maybe that was part of the intrigue, was like, wait, is Magneto, is he right?
I mean, one of the memes that would come out of early, in internet comic book culture was Magneto was right.
Yeah.
And there are lots of aspects to it that it's like, well, how many, especially if you compare real life years compared to comic book years, the Marvel 616 universe, the main Marvel universe, has only been from the Fantastic Four to now, it's somewhere in the neighborhood of only 15 to 20 years, despite the fact that in real life, that was 1963.
Yeah.
But it's like, if you've been reading these characters for this long and you don't see the change happening that the good guys are fighting for, you wonder, well, how wrong is this person who I've seen as a villain? And I think if you look at the original version of Magneto, Magneto was written very much as a terrorist. As the comic book medium got more sophisticated, there was a lot more nuance. And we started to see, it's not just the mustache twirling villain anymore. These villains have depth to them. And the depth is where it's like, are they really that wrong in what they're doing?
Yeah.
It's like you might not agree with the method, but is he wrong for how he feels?
And even on the other side of that, you kind of show Professor Xavier kind of like messing up at times. Like the courtroom thing is a good example because like you see like, right, you at that point, you're a little bit more on Xavier's side. You're like, okay, we can work through the process and blah, blah, blah. Which I also remember thinking, watching that episode, like, Beast also comes from a little bit of privilege because like he's like, the legal system will work. And it's like, well, that's coming from someone who the legal system works for, like,
right.
But then you seem like it's starting to, I don't know, I guess it depends on your perspective. It may or may not be working. But then Sabretooth comes in, Magneto's side of things kind of comes in and just like messes it all, any chances of it working. And it is this tug of war that keeps going back and forth. It's like one of them's making a little headway. We're like, okay, this guy's
right,
a little bit more right, then they keep messing each other up. So you just never really, at least in this beginning part, we're not really like settled on like who is actually doing like the black and white clear cut right thing.
Right. And I think that's part of the appeal to this is whether we're ever going to get the answer of, is there a black and white clear cut, scenario. And the funny thing is when you mention Beast as being the one who has a level of privilege to think that the legal system is going to work for him as well, he's the one that you would imagine would be the hardest to have that perspective because visually he does not pass as a human.
Yeah.
You look at Rogue, you look at Storm, you look at Cyclops or Jean. Cyclops, as long as he's wearing sunglasses.
Yeah.
Beast can't pass as human. He has no way of passing as human, but he still has faith that the system works because of what he saw up until that point.
Yeah.
And it's like, could this be a defining point for Beast of not believing that the system works anymore?
Starts like jading him.
Yeah.
Because we also don't know like when Beast manifested. I think like if you hadn't read comics and stuff, you don't know that yet. I think like for kids who were like familiar with X-Men stuff, we kind of got this idea of like around puberty or something.
They start to mention the puberty aspect of it. The piece that is missing from the show where we are right now, to your point, is when did the blue hair and the animalistic aspect of Beast surface? Because in the original version of the comics, he was just like built like a brick shit house and had like kind of the ability to grab shit with his feet. He just looked like a slightly unusual human. He didn't have the blue hair. The blue hair wasn't until his scientific mind goes off the rails and he turns himself into that further evolution.
As if there wasn't enough intriguing stuff in that two-parter intro. This one just kind of, like you said, it threw in Magneto and then the internal fight. I don't know. There's a lot to throw at kids, but it wasn't too much, I feel like. I think we all like loved it. So that's it for this episode. Thanks for joining us. If you have any thoughts, make sure to drop them in the comments for either the YouTube upload or official Instagram post about this episode. And if you like what you heard, we'd appreciate your rating on the podcast app of your choosing.
Yeah, we don't have an official outro that we've decided on as a duo, so we're just going to say goodbye and we will talk in your direction next week.